Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 13th of March, and today we're looking once again at the culmination of the Russian breakthroughs deeper and deeper into Kursk, and now the complete capture of the city of Sudzha. We'll look at the proof for that. We'll look at reports coming out from both sides about new Russian movements as they approach the border with Sumy in new locations. We're also going to look at developments along other parts of the front line because we're going to see an uptick in clashes and Russian movement in other locations. There's also a Ukrainian counterattack currently going on in Shevchenko, so we'll analyze the movement over there. We'll also look at Putin's comments regarding a proposed ceasefire. This was discussed by the United States and agreed to by Ukraine during meetings a couple of days ago in Saudi Arabia. So we'll hear what Putin's position on the matter is and what preconditions he has for agreeing to such an arrangement. But let's begin by zooming in on Kursk once again. We have over here two locations where we know that the Russians have been able to acquire additional territory. So first of all, just to the west of Sudzha, the Russian forces have continued to expand control and have taken over nearby suburbs, and that largely includes the suburb of Zaoloshenko and also some infiltrations into Goncharovka. Although Russian sources do acknowledge that there are still several Ukrainian groupings that are located within the suburb that are trying to hold on to the front line and are acting as a vanguard force. Earlier today in the afternoon, there were two Ukrainian tanks that engaged with Russian forces and they were stationed within the suburb. They fired towards the city center in Sudzha and they were eventually repelled. But Ukrainian infantry do still remain, and they're, of course, all hiding in the basements of these houses. These houses, for the most part, are intact, meaning that they are pretty good positions to stay in, to try to dig in, especially in some of these larger structures, including the local hospital and a couple of other multi-story buildings. But the Russian forces are very quickly closing in. We know that today they captured 14 square kilometers in this location as they took over most of Zaoloshenka, and there are geolocated videos of the Russian movement through this location. I just need to find the marker over here. This is from March 12th. It's footage from the Piatnashka Brigade, which is a DPR affiliated unit. It was moved a couple of months ago to engage with fighting generally to the east of Sudzha, and now it's involved with clearing out the city and its environs. So they released footage of their soldiers moving through the roads and going into houses, clearing them out. There really was little to no resistance. In a couple of cases, they did engage in firefights with small Ukrainian groupings in isolated houses. But again, we're talking about really on a smaller scale. The larger Ukrainian groupings are located at the core of Goncharovka, and the Russian forces are beginning to push westwards in that direction. More generally, you also have a Ukrainian grouping that remains and is notable in Golevka and in Rubonshina. Then a bit to the west, there may also be some Ukrainian presence on the Sudzha border crossing. Besides that, Russian forces are beginning to assault the town of Oleshnya, and they're doing so from the south, from an area that was not expected from the Ukrainian side. You can see that it is very close to the border. The Russian forces over here captured 7.4 square kilometers of territory. They utilized the bridgehead west of the Psel River that they were able to cross a couple of weeks ago, around mid-February. That's when it first started. And then from there, branched out into forested locations that are just to the west of Kurilovka. And since then, they've been able to entrench themselves. Ukrainians failed to counterattack and squeeze them out. As a result, now you see the Russians seeping into the rest of the span of this forested area, getting very close to the border, cutting off the local route used by the Ukrainians for a couple of weeks as their flanks were beginning to get compressed. And from there, when you look at the maximum advance of the Russian soldiers in a northwestern direction, they were able to advance over the past couple of days 4 kilometers northwestwards and are now knocking on the door of Oleshnya. They've not been able to take it just yet, but there are reports of very heavy Russian FPV swarms targeting the village and whatever Ukrainian small squads are still located over there. You can also see how this sort of maneuver is flanking whatever remnants of Ukrainian forces are located in Melovoy. And actually, according to some Russian sources, the front line looks like this, wherein the Russians have been able to take the entirety of the rail line and essentially everything that is south of Goncharovka, including some of the local trenches built on the perimeter of Sudzha and the gullies with a lot of tree lines and forested locations. That's possible. I just haven't seen proof of it. And I would want to see an indication before I make a change to show that a village like Melovoy is under full control of the Russian forces. And then by extension, also the northern part of Krylovka, where there appears to be Ukrainian resistance, or at least there was before the entire collapse occurred. Right now, we don't have any concrete information about the status of the northern section of this hamlet. But a bit to the south, we do have continued clashes between Russian side and the Ukrainian garrison in Guevo and Gornal. So there was footage released by the 129th Territorial Defense Brigade, which is one of the most active Ukrainian units in Kursk at this moment. They're playing a big role in ensuring the territorial integrity of Guevo, as Russian forces are reported to have crossed over the Psel River and are beginning to seep themselves into the eastern forests and forests just to the north of the town, although they've not been able to make their presence known within the residential areas of Guevo just yet. So they released footage of Russian infantry squads crossing over the Psel River over the past couple of days, doing so on boats, and then also using a submerged BTR. Eventually, it was abandoned. And so, in some of the drone footage, you can actually see that BTR as it's partially submerged under the river's water. But nonetheless, you saw boats and then forces that were operating across it. They were struck individually by the 129th Brigade, and a lot of those forces were probably and still are going to be courted to move southwards and engage in offensive activities on Guevo. Then maybe from the 40th Marine Brigade, because that's a unit that's been active around here recently. They also have battalions of the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade that could be deployed to this location, although maybe they're also involved with the assault right now towards Oleshnia. We don't exactly know. We do know that Pietnashka and the 11th VDV brigade, they, for instance, are the ones that are really spearheading the deeper push west of Sudzha. And so that's just an understanding of the order of battle. But it does appear that the Ukrainians would like to drag out the fighting over here in this southernmost portion of the Kursk pocket that remains under their control for as long as they can afford, because this region is slightly less exposed than the locations to the north in Gogolevka and Gornochka. You can see over here that it's nearly 50 square kilometers that remains under Ukrainian control over here, and it just sort of naturally flows into the rest of Sumy Oblast because it's pretty close to some supply routes like Sapsilia, Miropilia, Velika, Rybitsia. But then again, the Russian forces have their own reasons for advancing over here. They would like to make it known that the entirety of Kursk has been retaken and that all the villages have been, reestablished under their dominion. So for those reasons alone, the Russians will be able to dedicate whatever resources they need and redirect them from other locations that are currently being cleared out with very minimal resistance, and will be able to eventually push out the Ukrainians from these locations. Then same thing goes for the other location over here to the north, this pocket that is in much more trouble right now. I would say there probably are still a couple hundred Ukrainian soldiers located generally in these locations from Goncharovka all the way to the border crossing. And then there may also be a couple hundred located in Guevo and Gornal. So the withdrawal is not complete, but we're looking at a garrison of Ukrainian forces that estimated to be at around 40,000. And so the vast majority of them, nearly all of them, are located now in Sumy and now are operating on, you would say, a smaller front line because they don't have to deal with intricacies of defending a pocket in its entire perimeter over here. So we're going to really keep a keen eye on how they get deployed in the future, where they are located. But for now, when it comes to the most active units, I have to reiterate, it's the 129th TDF Brigade, its Array Battalion, and the 22nd Special Purpose Battalion of the Presidential Brigade. Those are the units that stand out. Now, to look at the situation in Luhansk and further west on the Oskil River front, you can see over here a slight Russian advance south of Zakhryzhove. This includes capture of 3.3 square kilometers of territory running along a rail line and a local road, the R79. It's not local, actually, it's a highway, really important highway to the east of the Oskil. And as a result, we now know that the Russians are approaching the village of Bohuslavka. It's an important village as it acts as an intermediary between the line of contact and the supply route moving southwards all the way to Borova itself, and of course the trench perimeter that surrounds Borova. Borova being the largest Ukrainian possession across the Oskil River besides Kupiansk itself. And Kupiansk is really in its own theater right now because you can see how the two northern and southern locations east of the river have been split up, and so Borova really acts as its own center of gravity, and it's really large. It acts as a coordination point between the logistics from the west and then crossing over this bridge over here. There are two layers that you can see clearly fleshed out over here, meant to defend the perimeter of the town. So you can understand its importance as a result. And it's just an area where a lot of roads converge throughout the entirety of Kharkiv Oblast. So it is an important location, and you can see the movement of the Russians really beginning to close in on it from this northern axis, but then also the movement of the Russian soldiers in recent months from Steppe to Kopaniki, and then just solidifying control over large scale ridges and open fields that overlook some of these defensive lines. That will allow them to shape the battlefield in such a way that will then eventually give them an opportunity to cross over the second line of defense and then close in on Borova. But again, the pace is so small over here because Russian troop commitments are very small. And then by extension, any sort of delivery of equipment is going to be really at the back burner for this part of the front line because it's one of the lower objectives that the Russians have right now. But nonetheless, just on a daily basis, we do see some of these tactical maneuvers like the one over here. And we know about this because of footage from March 12th of the 4th Tank Brigade, which is one of the key units operating in this location on the Ukrainian side, as they conducted grenade drop operations onto advancing Russian soldiers. Another area where we do have indication of a Russian advance is west of the Zherebets River. This amounts to 2.6 square kilometers of territory captured, and this shows us that the Russians have been able to enter into Novolyubivka based on the geolocation of the 66th Mechanized Brigade shelling Russian soldiers as they entered into this location. So this is interesting as well because now we're seeing the Russians begin to cross over. They already established a rather deep bridgehead west of the river in an area that isn't really populated. It's an area that just consists of open fields, forested locations, and then this trench that extends northwards, and it's north of Kolydyazi. So now you actually have one of the final Ukrainian villages that is very close to the riverbank, close to some Russian positions that are currently being converted into forward operating posts like Balkazhirovka and Novosadove, and the Russians were just beginning to clear it out. By extension, you could see how they would want to get control over the rest of Luhansk Oblast in this location due to high elevation, due to the trenches located over here, due to some key forested areas. And then they would give them the linchpin needed to reach the next line of populated areas, which would be between Nove and Novomikhailivka. This is an area that really has not been affected by the war in recent times, but it's a line that the Russians would probably like to overrun at some point. But once again, when we're looking in this region, it is much lower when it comes to tactical objectives. And so then as a result, the allocation of resources is usually, secondary or tertiary. To look at another area that's really been ignored over the past couple of years, it's the area that's not even on the Seversk front. It's sort of just this filler region, this sort of liminal location that's in between the Bakhmut, or now Chasiv Yar, and Seversk fronts. It's a region that spans from Hurivka, as I would refer to it, all the way to Sako Ivenseti. It's like 20 kilometers of just really stale location where you just see stagnant fighting, barely any shelling from either side, just a complete lull when it comes to activity. But recently, we've seen two examples of the Russian forces advancing over here on a positional scale. So you could see here small advance by the Russian side west of Sako Ivenseti, and this is from March 12th, 54th Mechanized Brigade shelling Russian forces north of the Vasyukivka River. Very narrow river indeed. Over here, March 13th, 30th Mechanized Brigade, they struck Russian column that entered into Vasyukivka, the village itself, which is pretty wide in nature, so it's difficult to take over in one fell swoop with a single column, but they were, as a result, able to capture 1.25 square kilometers of territory in the eastern portion of the village, and now they have that sort of really important bridgehead that will allow them to advance along the main road eventually and reach the other populated areas in this location. There actually is a lot of potential for advances over here because there is a lack of Ukrainian troop allocation for this region. You don't have as many defenses built along this 20-kilometer span. And then it would actually give the Russian forces an opportunity to flank a lot of the positions that are more ingrained and more difficult to dislodge head on, like Holubivka, Minkivka, or Vasyukivka. Basically, everything running along the E40 highway all the way to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk to the northwest. But again, because this area just is chronically ignored and overlooked, it's an area that whenever we do see movements, it's due to the initiative of the local garrison, usually, and not necessarily due to orders to advance from higher ups. In any case, though, we see that there is movement over here north of Frihorivka. nearly 3 square kilometers of territory captured by the Russian side, including the entirety of these houses in the northern part. So the entirety of the village has been taken over, along with some nearby forested areas. As a result, you're seeing the Russians get closer and closer to the Donbass Canal and its adjacent trenches in this location, and then from there strengthening the southern flank that would be needed to get control over the rest of Vasyukivka. But once again, the pace is extremely slow over here. In Toretsk, we do have a couple of updates. So let's zoom in over here. Russian forces have been able to retake some of the lost territories that they were forced to cede to the Ukrainian side in the course of their counterattacks. So over here, you can see the Russians getting control over a couple of hectares based on the video from the Predator police units as they conducted FPV strikes onto individual houses and buildings in Toretsk. This one is in the northern parts, very close to a local slag heap. So the Russians were able to just establish some positions over there. And in addition, you can see this is really interesting. Russian forces were geolocated being struck by Ukrainian FPVs in an area that is even further east of this outstretched pocket over here, or outstretched salient, I should say. The issue is the Ukrainians, they were able to infiltrate pretty deep into the Russian lines from Krimska all the way to some of the high-rise apartment buildings in the center of Toretsk. But then the line needed to retain control, this 1 kilometer line that runs through the city. It became extremely exposed from this western flank, and the Russians were able to get control, of course, on March 7th, so a week ago. And since then, they've retained control and actually expanded deeper. And now they're very close to cutting off the entirety of this Ukrainian pocket. The only thing that separates it really is a potential speculative Ukrainian presence in the Toretsk Stadium and some nearby buildings. And so, for all intents and purposes, if there are Ukrainian soldiers over here, then they are essentially cut off from both sides. But the question is whether there actually are Ukrainians over here, because the last proof we had of the Ukrainian movement was on March 8th, and it was really small scale. It was just shelling a single building. So it's entirely possible that due to the fluidity of the fighting, that in certain cases you do have deep infiltrations that are transient and eventually get quelled, and then you just see movement back up north, meaning that everything that's on the course to the extremely deep geolocation is not necessarily under the control of the side that is conducting the infiltration. And in this case, that would be the Ukrainians. So I can't say with certainty, and that's why I'm just keeping the map as it is right now in this really weird contortion. But I just have no other choice because I don't want to make any sort of assumptions that are out of pockets. So for now, we'll just keep that front line indicating that there was a Russian advance on the western flank of that infiltration. Now, an area where the Ukrainians definitely have been able to regain territory is in Shevchenko. Nearly the entirety of the village actually has been retaken by the Ukrainian side. And this is important, and I'll explain the significance of the Ukrainian counterattacks over here. So, Shevchenko, you can see Ukrainians nearly took back 1.6 square kilometers of territory. The Free Ukraine unit, they posted on their Telegram a compilation of strikes on Ukrainian units. So over here, the Skala regiment was hit by artillery. It was hit by grenade drops and FPV strikes. You could see how it reaches as far south as the pond, that it's even further south than the village itself. And then there's also some geolocations from populated areas and some of the multi-story buildings, duplexes in the center of Shevchenko, all of them under control of the Ukrainian side due to the activities of Skala, which is specialized in these sort of operations. They conducted similar attacks in Pischane, but were eventually repelled, and more success was eventually yielded in the entrance to Shevchenko. So they doubled down on that and have actually been able to take it over in its entirety. Similar things also happen in Lysivka and Dechenske, all with the goal of ensuring that the final line of villages before reaching the suburbs of Pokrovsk remains under Ukrainian control and acts as a sort of buffer zone between the Russians and their line of contact and their organization points and the Ukrainian positions within Pokrovsk itself, because they do want to turn it into a long-term bastion of defense. We're talking about a long-term in the sense of the entirety of 2025. That's what they're hoping for the Ukrainian side. And that's reflective in the sort of commitment they have to counterattacks whenever the situation becomes difficult for the flanks of Pokrovsk, as we're seeing now. And the situation is, of course, getting relieved as a result of these counterattacks. So Shevchenko, the situation here is that if the Ukrainians are able to retain control over here, they would have this outstretched pockets and would give them an opportunity to attack Pischana from the southeast. So it is important for them to solidify control and ensure that they're not cut off themselves. And then from a Russian perspective, it would then be important to ensure that they are not assaulted and caught by surprise through the open fields and tree lines located to the south of Pischane, because they succeeded in a grueling battle for a couple of weeks and back and forth to retake the village and now they should ensure that it remains under their control in order to have some sort of proximity to the suburbs in Pokrovsk itself. Because whenever the Russians retain proximity, then they're able to move in their firepower array and exert additional pressure onto the Ukrainians and just further attrit them as they're located in those command posts that are closer and closer to the front line. So that's the task of the 74th Motor Rifle Brigade. But more generally, the Ukrainian goal over here, and it is maximalist, that's completely true. And I don't know how likely it is, but it's definitely something they're hoping to do. It would be to completely get rid of this outstretched salient that the Russians have been able to create for themselves and carve out. I'm going to just go over to perimeter over here. You can see that I'm going over here, and it sort of extends all the way from the Kotlina region as far south of the Solana River and Novotroitska. It's an area that is pretty large in surface area, but largely consists of open fields, and it just has a complete lack of roads. There are barely any paved routes over here, and not even dirt roads. You can see that Vovkove, Solone, Pischane, parts of Kotline are the Russian holdings in this location. And this area is so important because it gives the Russians the sort of linchpin that they need in order to have that sort of foot in the door into the Pokrovsk larger urban cluster, and also towards the roads leading into it, like the E50 highway. And so the Ukrainians, if they were to take this back in this area, it's probably not that much, but taking it back would then relieve the western flank of Pokrovsk entirely. There would be no more immediate threats to the situation for the Ukrainians on the highway leading into Pokrovsk. There would be no worry of a physical encirclement or any sort of undermining of positions that are located to the west of the city. And so that would be a huge relief. It would allow for a new stable front line that's shortened, that would be able to hold out potentially for an extended period of time, because then all the resources could be committed to that singular line that is pretty straight, you could say pretty horizontal. It would be like an 8 kilometer line. And then Pokrovsk would be in a much better state and could actually see some sort of longevity. That would be the Ukrainian hope. And it's something that they will have to try to actualize now, because in the coming weeks, I would not be surprised if you started to see troop movement of some Russian forces away from the Kursk region. Because again, we're looking at a garrison of 70,000. Some of the units were split off from elements that were operating in Donetsk, not necessarily in Pokrovsk, more so in Chasiv Yar, but they could still be moved and shuffled to ensure that they are operating in this part of the front line, because it is absolutely necessary for the Russians to ensure that they have control over this outstretched pocket. And it is difficult for them to do so. That's completely true, because there are a lack of roads over here. You could see there's a highway from Novotroitska to Shevchenko, but that does not connect to areas like Vovkove or to the front line near Kotline. And so those troops have to move on foot, they have to move on private vehicles, and then they get bogged down with a lot of the mud and just lack of infrastructure. They get a lot of inundation of Ukrainian drones attacking from all sides, and Ukrainian drone coverage could attack the entirety of this pocket over here, this salient, due to how narrow it is in actuality. Because we're talking about like a 9 kilometer line, so on either side it could be attacked, and so the logistics over here are also pretty difficult. And that's playing a role in making it difficult for the Russians to move in resupplies quickly, to engage in the arduous process of fighting in some of these villages. So that's sort of the thinking, and I believe that the solution for the Russian side would be to move in reinforcements to hold the line and ensure that the Ukrainians will not be able to further infiltrate in the future before it reaches some sort of critical mass and becomes more difficult to defend. But from a Ukrainian perspective, they need to really increase their pace of attacks over there as soon as possible, because they may not have a better chance to do so in the future. And I believe that is it for the frontline updates. We'll just look once again at the comments made by Putin in relation to the ceasefire agreements. So, whenever Putin discusses the American involvement in the negotiations, he's actually pretty thinking of the United States and of the Trump administration. He's trying to position himself in a way where when he provides lip service to Trump and is generally on good terms in order to set the framework for a resumption of negotiations, normalization with the United States, because his hope would, of course, be to see a split between the United States and Ukraine and an end to their military partnership. So he's always like flattering of Trump and trying to sort of subscribe to his view of the way in which the conflict should eventually meet a peaceful end. So he likes giving sort of the rhetorical support for that and sort of just paying homage to the platitudes associated with that. But yeah, Putin started off his speech because he talked about the ceasefire for like 7 minutes when he was meeting with Lukashenko. And he said that he thanked President Trump. He said that he agrees with the principle of peace in Ukraine, and even with the idea of a ceasefire, but that there would have to be certain stipulations and questions that had to be answered, meaning that there will be continued talks. It's not that he's dismissing it out of hand, at least officially in a public setting. We know that the special envoy for President Trump, who's been monumental in ceasefire discussions in Gaza, for instance, Steve Woodcock, he was in Moscow. I think he still is actually, and he's talking with high-level Russian officials about the ceasefire proposal that the Ukrainians already agreed upon. They agree with the framework in Saudi Arabia, and as a result, the United States resumed intelligence sharing with Ukraine, and of course, the military aid that was coming in through those convoys that landed in Poland. The issue is, from Putin's perspective, he hopes that a ceasefire would actually just be the beginning of a long-term solution and conclusion to the war. And that conclusion would, of course, be under his framework for what he would like to see and an achievement of his war objectives. And although we don't have the exact demands that he provided to the United States, we know that the United States received those demands and that they are aware of that. They're discussing those with the Russian side. So clearly the Russians have a certain demand they would have for ending the war, and a ceasefire could be the beginning of that. But it wouldn't just be an action in isolation. And the Ukrainians, on the other hand, when they agreed to the ceasefire, it seemed a lot like they were hoping that it would be just sort of a one-off opportunity and just a singular a moment without a broader process of ending the entire conflict. And I say that because they would not be able to, get some sort of resolution under their own strategic framework that still is able to bode well with Russia's overarching strategic framework for ending the war. And so then that sort of stopgap compromise that would appease the Trump administration and show that the Ukrainians are willing to pursue peace while still maintaining support in the case that peace didn't end up working out, would be by agreeing to a 30-day ceasefire as proposed by Trump. And so that's the logic behind Ukraine agreeing to it. Of course, the Russian side, they're not going to agree to it on its own because then it would give the Ukrainians the opportunity to revamp their forces, get them out of Kursk, whatever remnants they have over there, and regroup in certain locations, continue to increase mobilization. And so Putin made that very clear in his speech. He talked about how there would have to be mechanisms, enforcement mechanisms, to see who would violate the agreement, and he raised a number of questions. First of all, what would happen to the soldiers that remained in Kursk? What happened to the couple hundred Ukrainian soldiers over there? Would they just be able to leave without being targeted by the Russian side? Because clearly he views that as being unacceptable. So that was something that has to come up in discussions of a ceasefire. And probably by the time that there could actually be serious headway made, if that ever does happen, by then the Kursk region will actually just be under complete Russian control. So I don't know how much of an issue that is in the totality of things. Besides that fact, Putin talked about the need to ensure Ukraine doesn't use it as an opportunity to simply revamp its forces, continue to bring in military equipment from the United States, and to increase its mobilization efforts, because people in the Ukrainian Rada, like the people's deputies over there, they're discussing the need to continue with mobilization and actually increase the amount of volunteers coming in from the 18 to 24-year-old cohorts during that 30-day period. And so the Russians, of course, don't want to give the Ukrainians a free timeout that would give them time to better prepare defenses for then a resumption of hostilities later on. So that's one concern. And then the other concern that we said, the overarching concern, is that Putin would like it to be a part of a broader plan that would see the Ukrainians agreeing to his strategic objectives and war goals that he set out at the beginning of the war, relating to territory that has to be captured, Ukraine's security situation, the amount of investment that the Ukrainians could receive from external forces, and just their own buildup when it comes to military composition. So all of those factors are playing a role in Putin's thinking and the way that he's discussing the situation with the United States. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.